All right. Well, first of all, let me thank everybody for taking a little time out of their Friday to join us for a fascinating talk today on the topic of medical misinformation, which seems timely given some of the recent developments at the federal level, perhaps. So I'm really thrilled to welcome Heather Voorhees as our Lunch and Learn guest speaker today. This is the second speaker in the misinformation series that we're doing this year as part of the ALA Carnegie Whitney grant. So I'll introduce her. We'll have probably about 40 minutes or so for her remarks, and then we'll certainly set some time aside at the end for any questions or comments. Open it up to the audience for your all's perspectives on this important topic. So Heather Voorhees is an associate professor in the Communication Studies Department of the University of Montana. Her research and teaching focus on interpersonal health communication, particularly in the context of chronic illness, and she has published more than a dozen empirical research articles in peer-reviewed journals. She teaches classes such as health and family communication, communication and aging and health misinformation, and others. After earning her PhD from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, Voorhees completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Health Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. Go Longhorns, Heather, that's my undergrad. Before she joined academia, Voorhees worked as a newspaper reporter for small town and suburban papers, followed by a position as an internal communications manager for a large hospital system in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Voorhees.
All righty. Good morning for me. Good afternoon for you. I am super excited to be joining you from all the way up in Montana. So I'm very excited to be here today to talk about this really important and as Brandon said, unfortunately quite timely topic. So I am going to jump on into, I have a slideshow for you to look at because I know you don't just want to look at me the whole time. If you have questions, it might be easier to leave them to the end, but I'll try to be kind of watching for hands up. And Brendan, if there's something pressing, if you want to stop me and let me know as well. So can y'all see my screen there? Thumbs up. Perfect. Okay. So yeah, just a little bit about who I am, because I think it's important to know your sources, right? So as Brendan said, I am associate professor here at the University of Montana. I joined here during the pandemic. My first year at Montana was exclusively online teaching. So I actually hit campus about 3 times my first full year at a new job, which was fun. So I do research things around health interpersonal communication, so how 1 or 2 people talk about health or illness. And I particularly look at the chronic illness context, so things that can be treatable but not curable. And in there, I look specifically at things like illness identity. How does a chronic illness become part of who you are and how you move through the world? I look at things like disclosure, how you decide to tell people anything about your health or illness, and then also social support. So I do like to point out that before I came to academia, which I came to it quite late in life, this is my actually 3rd career. I started out as a newspaper reporter. So I've seen that side of things, and I can talk about what reporters do and what they don't do and how much time they have and how much time they don't have, which I think adds a lot of depth to some of the things I talk about. But I also did work as an internal communication manager for a large hospital system in the Minneapolis area. So I also worked with directly with physicians and specialists and cafeteria workers and techs and pharmacists and the whole lot. So I've really kind of seen health communication from a lot of different areas. My research isn't specifically in health misinformation, but it's something I've become really, really interested in because it's become much more relevant and timely. And I've been asked to speak a lot of places on misinformation and what it is and how people can resist it. I think there's a hunger there to learn more about what this is and how we can protect ourselves from it. So I've definitely done a lot of presentations, a lot of work in that area. So today what I'm going to do is, I have so much information I wanted to share with you, but I had to trim it down in the interest of time. So I'm going to go over just a few kind of heavy topics and kind of give you a really quick and dirty introduction to misinformation and how we can address it. So first, thinking about some foundational definitions. What are we actually talking about when we talk about misinformation? I want to point out, and I always teach this in my classes too, that misinformation is not a personal issue, it is a social issue. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I'm going to give you some tips on how to identify misinformation. But as you probably know, that's becoming trickier and trickier every day. But then I'm going to leave you with some strategies for how to challenge that misinformation, both for you as a person in your own personal life, but also you in your role as a librarian who is a trusted source of information. So hopefully leaving you on a positive note at the end here. But first, let me tell you a story. Let me take you way back. All right. So picture this. It's the mid 1300s, and a book has just come out titled The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, commonly known as Mandeville's Travels. This book purportedly details the worldwide travels of respected Englishman Sir John Mandeville. And so some of his adventures were outrageous. Some of these stories were wild beyond belief. But this book was actually used as a reference, and it was said to inspire Christopher Columbus to try to explore new worlds. All right. Now, there were some wild stories in this book. Chief amongst them was the existence of something called the vegetable lamb of Tartary. And what this was, is was described as a plant that had human blood inside of it, and it grew small melons that eventually would develop into living, breathing lambs that were connected to the plant by this umbilical cord. Now, this plant, according to Sir John Mandeville, was supposedly thriving in Central Asia. Now, this story was fantastical, obviously, right? Plants don't grow blood, they don't grow living being things. But an Italian friar around this time also wrote about the vegetable lamb. Now, he hadn't experienced it himself, but he heard others talk about it. So he wrote all about its majesty and how wonderful it was. And it's a sight to behold. For 300 years, this story of the vegetable lamb of Tartary persisted. People talked about it, they wrote about it, they made illustrations. Even skeptics were eventually turned into believers by sheer popularity of this story. It wasn't until 1683, 300 years later, when a detailed, thorough scour was ordered and no proof of anything like this was absolutely found. Okay. Now, it seems really silly to us now to think about how this story persisted for 300 years. But think about it. Think about the things that we believe, that we trust, that we ourselves have never seen. I have never been to outer space, but I believe NASA when they give me pictures of, the solar system. I do not have any tools at home to verify this, but I believe the Red Cross when they tell me that my blood is A positive. So think about the things that we believe simply because we're told we're supposed to believe them. And think about how we pass those lessons along. Okay. That will set the stage for understanding and really digging into this idea of misinformation. So on that end, let me introduce you to the really basic foundations of what is misinformation. There's kind of three different flavors of misinformation, if you will. The first is what we call misinformation. Now, this is information that is inaccurate and it's unreliable, but it's passed along maybe inadvertently and without malice. The person who spreads misinformation is not doing so to try to hurt anyone. They're doing it simply because they maybe don't know any better. So I would say the vegetable lamb of Tartary was probably a really good example of misinformation. It wasn't trying to persuade people to do something or buy something. It was simply a story that was passed along without anyone really checking on it. So think about when someone sends you a news article about a flu outbreak and they're really scared because the flu this year is, oh, it's going to be such a bad one. And you say, well, actually, this is a story from 4 years ago. So it's misinformation. It's not correct, but it's not necessarily meant to hurt you. Okay. But we also have something called malinformation. And this is the idea that some information stems from the truth. There's a kernel of the truth there, but it's exaggerated or changed in a way that misleads you and causes potential harm. Okay. So think about maybe someone posting a photo that's taken out of context, or they're sharing a quote from someone famous, but it's intentionally missourced. Or think about, pictures that have been slightly altered to look convincing. Okay, they're doing this in a way that they want to convince you, they want to mislead you. So this is a little bit more dangerous than misinformation. All of them can cause problems, but this is more intentional. Last but not least, we have disinformation. This is flat out false lies that are deliberately spread specifically to try to fool someone. Okay. So think about scammers who try to scare you into buying a product. Think about someone who is trying to get you to give them money or get credibility. They're trying to frighten you, and they're doing this by using disinformation. Okay, this is deliberately spread specifically in order to deceive. Now, disinformation is perhaps the most dangerous, but it can also sometimes be the easiest to identify because it's often kind of the furthest out there and the most wild. Okay, so think about, I'm going to use the terms misinformation and malinformation a little bit interchangeably here just for the sake of simplicity, but know that there are different sort of levels or different flavors. Okay, so now that we kind of know what we're dealing with, let me talk about why I say that misinformation is a social issue. Misinformation and someone's vulnerability to it has little to do with someone's intelligence level or with their socioeconomic status. Some people are more vulnerable to being prey for some of these stories, but misinformation is not about people being dumb. And what I always stress in my class is it's not about you, stupid idiot. Why did you believe something like that? No, we are all victims of misinformation. I have a PhD and I have bought products that probably didn't do the things they said they were going to do. I take supplements that probably aren't going to be all that supplemental for me. I know better, right? I know better. I'm a smart person. It's not about that. Misinformation is a social issue, it's a social problem because as human beings, we are pack animals and we are primed to believe certain things and to trust certain people and to not think too deeply about certain things, right? So the example of the Red Cross telling me that, you know, I'm chock full of platelets, so I should come in and donate, and my blood type is A plus. I believe them because they are an authority. And so why wouldn't I believe in authority? We're trusted, we're primed to do that as human beings. Now, when we get certain authorities telling us straight up lies, that's where this becomes a real problem. But for now, let's focus on what we can control, right? So misinformation spreads among the pack for several different reasons, okay? Number one is uncertainty. We're not only pack animals, but we're people who want to know things for sure. And when we talk about health and illness, and particularly science, there is so much uncertainty, okay? There is so much we still do not know about the human body. One time out of every five that I go for my annual checkup, I'll present something to my doctor and he's like, could be this, it could be that, it could be this, I don't know, right? A lot of medical science is still meh because the human body is very, very complicated and there's room for a lot of uncertainty there, okay? A lot of health is just taking a good guess of what we think we know, okay? Think about the stories that we come into every day. Sometimes coffee is told to be good for us. Sometimes it's told that it's bad for us. Sometimes eggs are good for our heart. Sometimes they're bad for our heart. There's just a lot of uncertainty. And is it because researchers are dumb? No, it's because that's what science does. Science constantly disproves itself, and we build on information that we always have. So uncertainty is kind of just a name of the game when it comes to health and especially health research, okay? But because of that, because there is so much uncertainty, there's a lot of room for us to make up our own stories because human beings crave certainty. We do not do very well with the I don't knows of the world. Okay. So the more uncertainty there is, the more that opens up the space for rumors. So there is a very, very old 1947 kind of rule of thumb about rumors and how they perpetuate. So the basic law of rumors by Allport and Postman in 1947 says that you can tell how many rumors will pop up in a situation based on two things. Number one, the importance of the subject to individuals. And if you take that and multiply it by the ambiguity of the evidence pertaining to that topic, now you're going to get the total number of rumors in circulation within a network. So think about health and illness. It's very important to all of us. And I can attest it becomes more important the older that we get. So health is super, super important. And there's a lot of ambiguity there. We still don't really know what causes different types of cancer. We still don't really know, honestly, how to effectively treat cancer. Our cancer treatment methods are still really rudimentary in the grand scheme of things. So think about how that combination of things makes it really tempting for human beings to try to find their own explanations. And that's why rumors occur. That's why misinformation, malinformation, disinformation around health is so tempting because this topic is so important and there's so much ambiguity there. So add to that this idea that human beings also really, really crave control. We want to feel like the actions that we take and the things that we do are meaningful. We want to believe that we are masters of our own destiny. So when you add in all this uncertainty, that just really heightens our need to want to control the situation. And when we feel like we don't have any control, we become afraid. And that's when misinformation likes to come into our head. Fear and negative emotions open up that door for our brains to accept things that we maybe normally wouldn't. This is a really, really interesting study from 2012, and this really shows how health misinformation can spread in a really well-intentioned way based on our need for control and certainty. This was a study of 169 online cancer group support group members. And what they found is that 83% of these individuals admitted that the information they had heard about cancer was from non-medical sources, and most of that information was rumors. Okay. They also these rumors came from friends and family, mostly in face-to-face interaction. So this wasn't an idea of, oh, someone's Facebook post was misleading, or I heard this on Twitter. They were getting these rumors, which they acknowledged were rumors, from friends and family, which clearly probably want your best interest at heart, right? So these are people that we trust. And they found that they believed these rumors, their confidence in whether or not these rumors were correct was based on trusting the person they heard it from, regardless of that person's expertise, and whether or not this rumor seemed to confirm something that they already believed. More importantly, these folks in this study said that the rumors helped them because they helped them cope. And so they were open to this information. They wanted to hear this because they wanted that sense of control in the face of all this uncertainty. So when you start thinking about misinformation in this way, it starts becoming really clear that this isn't just a social media problem, and this isn't just an individual problem. This is a social problem that can persist even face to face, mouth to mouth. Okay. So lastly, health misinformation tends to spread because, again, bringing this home, we're social animals and we are built to trust the people around us. We're craving this certainty. We feel like we are out of control and we want to trust the people in our inner circles. Okay. We're built to do that. Back in the primordial days, we had to trust the people in our pack. We had to trust that they wouldn't kill us, that the meat that they brought back from the hunt was safe to eat. We're built to trust the people in our networks. Okay. Here's a really interesting example from 2013. Where I live, it's wildfire country. I know so much more about wildfires now than I ever thought I would ever know growing up in Minnesota and Nebraska. But this is a study that found that when considering the probability of a wildfire, of whether or not wildfire is something that is going to hit our neighborhoods, talking to our neighbors was as impactful as listening to wildfire experts, which is kind of bonkers when you think about it. But we tend to gauge the advice we get from our friends and family as heavily as advice that we get from experts because we're trained to trust those people. We're supposed to. And so when they're telling us something that's making us feel in control and relieving that uncertainty, those are the people that we listen to. So misinformation is not an individual issue. It is a social issue. And that's why it needs a social solution. Okay. So let me walk you through some tips that you can use to identify misinformation. Okay. What does it look like? How can we spot it? It could be trickier than you think. Sometimes disinformation is really obvious. Sometimes it's hiding and you have to do a little bit of digging. Okay. So there are three Health misinformation, malinformation, and disinformation in particular tend to align with. Okay. Number one is health misinformation tends to be negative. We're not out there spreading happy rumors about how wonderful things are and how much control we have. We tend to spread the negative, more uncertainty building misinformation. Okay. And we do that for a very simple reason. When we are afraid, when we are angry, when we are frustrated, when we are sad, our brains actually process information differently than when we feel confident and happy and secure. So if someone is trying to fool you or trying to persuade you of something, typically they're going to try to make you afraid. They're going to tell you the situation is dire. They're going to try to play on that emotion. So health misinformation, disinformation, malinformation in particular tends to be negative. Okay. It also tends to weave in personal stories or personal anecdotes. Now, why is that? Because of that idea of trust I just told you. If I tell you that, hey, my grandma tried this treatment and it totally didn't work, so you shouldn't try it either. Oh, well, I trust you and you trust your grandma. So we're going to build off of those personal narratives. Personal narratives are really powerful. And so it's a really good vehicle, honestly, to spread mis and malinformation. We often too hear these narratives in terms of someone's freedoms were being taken away, someone was injured, someone was hurt, someone had a bad experience with something. We probably all know someone in our lives who said, well, I'm not going to get the flu shot because XYZ over there had a really bad reaction to it. Okay, well, is that based in fact or is that one person's story? You know, there's truth in narratives as well, but narratives are often used to spread disinformation. And lastly, health mal and disinformation in particular often use anti-science narratives. We're often heard that the experts don't know what they're doing. We tend to see misleading statistics. We tend to see people saying, well, hey, I'm just asking questions. Why can't they figure XYZ out yet? Maybe it's because researchers don't know what they're talking about. We tend to try to build that mistrust. You can't believe them. You can believe me. I have the ticket to the certainty and control. Don't believe what other people are saying. Okay. So if you start looking around at some of the really clear examples of health mis and disinformation, you'll start to see that they tend to follow all three of these rules. Okay. So if you hear something that might be too good to be true, go over this checklist and see if it's hitting these high notes. All right. So I'm going to give you some of some health mis and mal and disinformation. And you can see here that these really fit the bill. Okay. They tend to build up that fear. They tend to try to break down your trust, especially in, them or they. They tend to be anti-science. Now, these are all examples from COVID because COVID was a field day for mis and disinformation, and it still is. So you can see these are all negative. These are all scary. These are all trying to break down your trust in government and in leaders and in the official narrative because my story is different. So you can see these are pretty obvious examples of disinformation. They seem too good to be true, and they kind of are. But think about how we start to, use those anti-science narratives, start building up that fear. So some of these examples are super obvious. Sometimes they're not. I'm going to give you an example of a piece of misinformation that I fell for even just last year. So how do you identify things that aren't as obvious as that? Okay, let me give you a couple of tools to use. First of all, and this seems obvious, but read past the headline and encourage all of your friends to read past the headlines. I know this is a no-brainer, but we're all busy people, and this is how news comes to us these days in little clips and little, tweets. I don't know what they're called now on X's. I don't know, but we're given little snippets. We're giving them little bites, but that's really, really dangerous. It's a really, really bad way to consume your news. So let me give you an example of why. Here was a super interesting article that I actually stumbled upon. And this was from Changing America. This is run by The Hill, which you may have heard of. They're a nonpartisan newspaper that tends to report on congressional political stuff, but sometimes they talk about health as well. So I came across this headline Drinking hot coffee may increase the risk of esophagus cancer. Oh no, I am on my fourth cup of coffee today. This is very applicable to me. What am I going to do? So I clicked into the story and very quickly I found that I had been sucked in. Okay. Because here's the problem. If you read past even just the headline, even just read the subhead, I'm begging you, because what you will see is the subhead disagreed with the headline. The headline tells me that coffee may increase the risk of cancer. The subhead itself says there is no evidence supporting the causal effect of coffee consumption on any major cancer type. What? So this confused me. So I started reading the article and I came across all kinds of gems within here. Because, first of all, this study didn't even really study coffee consumption, it was a study on genetics. They were looking at the genetic link between or for certain types of cancers. They weren't even looking at coffee. As it happened to one of the questions they answered was about coffee and tea consumption. And so the researchers were like, hey, let's look into that. What did they actually find? They find it had nothing to do with coffee consumption. The cancer rates that they found said that there may be an increased risk of throat cancer due to physical damage from repeatedly drinking hot liquids, which makes sense. If you're constantly drinking super, super hot liquid, you're perhaps causing some cellular damage, and that's where cancer may or may not, be have a better chance of coming into play. Okay, so this was a genetic study that had nothing to do with coffee, and somehow we got to this. Okay, so this is hiding. This is hiding, and it's hiding in plain sight. But in this case, all you had to do was read past the headline to understand that this story was not what it seemed. And oftentimes, if you read past the headline, that's going to be true. Okay. Sometimes, even if you read past the headline, it's still a little bit confusing. So you have to ask yourself, does the story seem too good to be true? And if it is, it probably is. Okay. So here's a really good example from Good Morning America. This was a headline that talked about a new study that links screen time with delayed development in babies. Oh my goodness. Oh, we don't want this. And so let's all, all the parents out there are definitely to be paying attention to this. Well, let's think about who these participants were, what the study actually found, who paid for this, and what some of the limitations were. Okay. Now, in this particular study, they surveyed 7,000 mothers in Japan. That's a great survey size. 7,000, that's amazing. I would pay a lot of money for 7,000 participants, right? But what they did is they asked these mothers of their memory of how much screen time their babies had had compared to their own perceptions of their baby's development today as a toddler. So if you're asking me as a parent, how much screen time do you think your baby got 4 years ago? Am I going to remember that? Anyone with toddlers knows that there's a lot going on. My memory is not necessarily going to be super clear about how many hours of screen time they got 3 years ago. Also asking these mothers, do you think your child is developing in a normal way? I mean, self-report surveys are always really flawed. And so can we trust these people's perceptions of whether or not their babies are, normal, above normal, below normal? So this was an interesting study. I would caution you heavily to take too much from this headline. Okay. So think about, what was the study actually doing? Who paid for it? A lot of times, if you scroll on down, you'll see that these studies were paid for by groups that directly benefited from the outcomes. Okay, you got to really look for that information, but it's there. Think about again, who are the participants? I just learned a couple of weeks ago that when it comes to Alzheimer's, a lot of Alzheimer's research is done on lab rats, on mice, because it's convenient, it's cheap, it's easy. We actually have about 200 different models on how to study Alzheimer's in mice. Here's a fun fact. Alzheimer's does not occur naturally in mice. So in order to study this in mice, we have to simulate Alzheimer's in the mouse brains in order to then test our treatments. So do those studies then directly correlate to treatments for human beings? Not necessarily. Should we still be doing these studies? 100% yes. We need to get every step closer. But caution yourself when a new study comes out about some breakthrough Alzheimer's treatment. Think really carefully about where that came from and who those participants were and what was actually found. Okay, take everything with a grain of salt. As a reporter, I can tell you, oftentimes we are not trained to report on medical science. Oftentimes we do not have the time to dig into these fully complicated empirical research articles. And so you end up with headlines like these. Okay, so a really good rule of thumb too is if you look back at the story, does it link back to its credible source? Okay, any decent story will link back to the new study or the evidence that they're trying to report on. So here's a really good example from the New York Times from an older study from 2019, and it was about using AI to help diagnose patients. And you'll see right here in the link, it linked back to the actual study from the British Medical Journal that they based this story off of. So any reader could click that link, they could go and they could find, this is an abstract that it linked back to, but it also gave you the reference. So you could actually go read that article yourself. Now, do I think you need to read every single study? No, you don't. But simply the fact that they're linking back to this is a really good sign that that story is trying to do due diligence and is probably pretty credible. Okay. But again, super disclaimer here, because as a reporter, I will tell you, it is hard to get things right. It is hard to trust the press release that came from an outside source based off of study by researchers, which were funded by a corporation. There's a whole chain here, and there's a lot that can go wrong. I am an intelligent person. I'm confident saying that. And I fall for this all the time. Okay, let me give you an example. This is just from last year. This was, or from this year, it's actually from March 2024. So on March 18th, the American Heart Association issued a press release, and they released a news story on their own website about the results of a new study that had yet to be released that showed that intermittent fasting, so like, not eating between certain hours of the day or not eating for certain days of the week, was tied to almost double your risk of cardiovascular death. Holy crap. This study made headlines immediately. Okay. Even my husband and I were talking about it at the day that it came out. He was like, "Do you see that thing about fasting?" I was like, "Yeah, I know." This is a huge, huge thing. And it came out from a press release from the American Heart Association. They themselves published it. They stood behind it. Now, if the American Heart Association endorses a research study, it has to be correct, right? Everyone should stop intermittent fasting. Yes? Not so fast. The story caused a huge uproar. And 2 days later, on March 20th, 2020, New York Times ran a story exploring that original study and adding a lot of much needed content. Okay. So in the study that the AMA was promoting, the participants completed 2 interviews less than 2 weeks apart, talking about what time they ate on the previous day. So the researchers then calculated the participants' average eating windows and assumed that was their typical eating study or schedule for the rest of their study. Okay. The participants were followed for an average of 8 years, and their answers to those 2 questions in the 8 years prior we never asked them again. So we assumed that people were fasting, even if they necessarily weren't. What if when you were asked, what did you have to eat yesterday? What if it was a really busy day at work and you skipped lunch and you ended up inadvertently fasting all day? Well, now you're in an 8-year study that says you are conducting intermittent fasting and you're probably going to die. Okay. So that was the study setup. At the end of 8 years, there were about 414 participants in the fasting group. And in that group, deaths from cardiovascular disease were more likely. However, these individuals were also younger, lower socioeconomic status, more likely to smoke, and less educated. And these factors were not accounted for in the end analysis. And instead, we end up with a headline that says intermittent fasting, higher death rate from cardiovascular disease. Okay. This study that this was all taken from was actually from notes from a conference presentation. The study had not been peer reviewed. It had not been accepted for publication. It was something that was presented at a conference. So even reliable sources can mangle this beyond belief and can create misinformation. Now, did the American Heart Association intend to fool you? No. Did they do their due diligence? No, they did not. So this is a case of misinformation, but it's still dangerous. And so it's hiding out there in plain sight. You start to see the problem here. Okay, it's not just crazy Facebook memes. It's kind of everywhere. So to that end, what can we do about this? Okay, how are we going to go out there and not only protect ourselves from misinformation, but try to protect people that we love? First thing I'm going to tell you, number one rule: information is not the best weapon against misinformation. It is super, super tempting to just tell people the truth. Just say, well, why would you believe that? Obviously, XYZ is true. Do not do that. Resist that. I can tell you this as a researcher and as someone who has had lots of fights with my own parents about health and health misinformation. Simply just saying, don't believe that is not going to work. All right. And there's several good reasons for this. First of all, when you tell someone the truth, when you tell someone a piece of information that does not align with their current beliefs and behaviors, you actually may close their mind even further. All right. This is a concept called psychological reactance. Perhaps you've heard this term before. This is a psychological concept. And it says that when someone feels as though their freedom is being threatened, either my freedom of belief or my freedom of behavior, I tend to put my guardrails up. And there's several different ways that I can react. I can either open myself up to new information, I can reframe the importance of the topic, or I can double down. And when I double down, that's called the boomerang effect. The more I think you're trying to threaten my freedom, the harder I'm going to push back against you. And that doesn't always come out as rational because it's not rational. It's this idea of psychological reactance. You're trying to tell me what to do. You're taking away my freedom, and therefore I'm going to react. I don't like that. Even if what you're saying makes sense, I'm going to push back. We saw this with very, very intelligent, very well-meaning people during COVID who did not want to wear masks. Mask wearing turned into an issue of American constitutional freedom. It wasn't about masks anymore. It was about don't tread on me. Okay, so a behavior that seemed so simple and so easy and so logical suddenly became this fight of laws off my body, which, it wasn't necessarily intended to be. But we had experts telling us so heavily, you have to do this, you have to do this. It became mandated. And so people, rightfully so, kind of backed off and said, I don't like this. You're threatening my freedom. So think about reactance, think about a boomerang effect. Think about the more you try to push something on someone, the more they are going to resist it, which makes total sense. Anyone with a toddler understands that the more you try to tell them to do something, the more they're going to not want to do that thing. Right? We're all kind of toddlers at heart. But also, feeling educated doesn't necessarily translate to reliable outcomes. Simply giving people information doesn't guarantee they're going to do what you want them to do. All right. There was a really, really interesting study in 2014 out of Wisconsin, and it was talking about how politics were tied to the issue of fracking, which in 2014 was like all the rage, and it still maybe in the coming years. But what they found is that they asked conservatives and liberals how educated they felt about fracking. Do you know what it is? Do you know what the outcomes are? Do you know why we do it? And what they found is that for conservatives, the more informed they felt about fracking, that correlated with a slightly more likely to think that it was bad or dangerous or environmentally hazardous. Okay. But for liberals, those who are more educated or felt more educated on fracking led to a huge boost in how dangerous or environmentally unsound they thought it was. So you have two groups of people who feel informed about the same topic, but they're still not thinking about it in the same way. One group thinks it's not great, but it's okay. And the other group thinks, no, it's terrible. So just giving people information doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to use it the way you think they should use it. All right. So information is not the best antidote to misinformation. So, okay, how do we do this? What is the antidote? Information plays a role, but we have to think about how we go about sharing that information. Sometimes people hold on to interpretations that we maybe see as misguided or misinformed, but their information has been proved or solidified by the people around them. It makes sense to them because that's what people are telling me. So, how can we give them some better ideas without pushing it on them, without threatening their freedom? There's something called transformative explanations. Now, this comes out of the world of risk and organizational communication, but I think it works here. So, transformative explanations aren't simply telling someone the right answer, they're demonstrating that maybe what they're holding on to might not be entirely correct. All right. So, this is a 5 step process, and I'm going to give you an example of this in the real world so you can start to think about how to use this. So, again, we're not necessarily trying to prove someone wrong. We're taking an idea that is around a concept that's confusing or important or hard to explain, and we're transforming their belief into something that's a little bit more adequate, a little bit more correct. Okay, transformative explanations. So the way that we do this is number one, you acknowledge what that person is going through. You state the lay view. Okay, you say, hey, I heard that you believe so and so. Is that correct? Like, oh, I heard that blah 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 happened. Okay, you say in your own words what this belief is. Number two, you acknowledge why it seems correct. Yeah, that makes total sense. It makes sense that you would believe that. Okay, you're showing this person that you understand what they're going through, that you empathize with them, that that there's evidence out there to support this belief. But then you demonstrate the inadequacy of this idea. Okay. I heard that you is blah, blah, blah. That totally seems correct. But actually, there's some scientific evidence that says otherwise. And I'll give you an example of this in just a second. Then you give them a more orthodox and maybe better understanding of that concept to kind of replace the misinformation that was in their head. You can't just tell them what they say is wrong. You have to give them something to replace that gap with. And lastly, we demonstrate the adequacy of our correct information. Here's actually some scientific evidence that might be more correct, and here's why I know that it might be more correct. Now, let me give you an example of this, okay? Let's say your best friend is visiting you, and he asks to use your bathroom. So while he's there, he snoops around, because that's what we all do, and he notices that your deodorant contains aluminum. So he becomes concerned, and he rushes out of the bathroom, and he says, you got to throw this away immediately because everyone knows that aluminum causes breast cancer, and I don't want you to get breast cancer. Okay. You might be very grateful for your friend's concern. It's great that he has your best interest at heart. That's wonderful. But this is a really good opportunity to correct this piece of information. So, using a transformative explanation, you could say, oh, yeah, I've heard that too. I've heard that aluminum causes cancer. You're stating that commonly held belief. And then you say, you know what, there was a lot of press around this in the early 2000s, and it totally seems legit. No one really knows what causes cancer, but chemicals are probably part of the problem, right? So you're acknowledging why this piece of information seems correct. Right? It makes sense that you would believe that. But now we're going to demonstrate why that information isn't quite adequate. Actually, though, the early studies that started this idea were conducted in a lab. And the researchers smeared deodorant directly to canine kidney cells in a petri dish. And that's not really how deodorant is used in the real world. And the cells were damaged, but we don't still even know which ingredient in the deodorant was the cause. Okay, so you're demonstrating why that belief is not necessarily adequate. You're conveying then a more orthodox understanding. You give them a new belief. There have been a lot of studies since then using a variety of techniques, and none of them have found a strong link between aluminum and any type of cancer. So you're replacing that misinformation with a more adequate idea. And then lastly, you're demonstrating why that new idea probably makes sense. In fact, the American Cancer Society has stated that there is no reliable link between deodorant and cancer, and they've even created a whole webpage to address this topic. You can go read on it for yourself. So this seems like a lot, this 5 step process. I get that. It seems, and it's hard to do. It takes practice. But you're not just telling someone that they're wrong, that they're dumb. I can't believe you believe that. You're giving them, you're acknowledging why they would believe that. You're empathizing with, yeah, it seems correct, but you're giving them a better piece of information to replace that. Okay. So librarians specifically have some specific roles here because you guys are powerhouse. your superheroes. And so there are ways that you can specifically address misinformation, not just in your personal life, but in society as well. And number one, I think it's really important to acknowledge the emotional aspect of misinformation. So again, don't just throw facts at people because that's not what this is about. Health misinformation spreads because people are uncertain, they feel like they're out of control, and they want desperately to feel like that they can make a difference. Okay, there's a huge emotional aspect to health misinformation. People want to believe they're doing the right thing. There was a really interesting study of the anti-vaccine movement in Australia, and they talked to some of the mothers who really, really heavily identify as anti-vaxxers. And they said that these folks believe that they are protectors of their children from an unseen danger that no one else is taking seriously, right? There's an emotional aspect to this. So acknowledge that and realize that information isn't always going to quell misinformation. But it's also really important to add nuance to the issue, okay? Having access to the research and the information that you do, you can help people understand that nothing is cut and dried. Nothing is 100%, okay? I recently read an op-ed in the New York Times discussing the debate over fluoride in drinking water. And it's easy to scoff and say that RFK is totally wrong. Oh my God, I can't believe you believe that. There's no evidence at all that fluoride is bad for you. But in reality, there are some shady research projects out there that you can find that demonstrate that incredibly high levels of fluoride have been linked in some populations to lower IQ. Now, these studies have been ripped apart because methodologically they were terrible. And the people in them were drinking like 400% their recommended dose of fluoride every day for like 12 years. But that research is out there. So you can help people acknowledge, yeah, like some studies have shown this. However, you have to really look at how those studies were done. And nothing is really cut and dry. Okay. To that end, you're in a really, really interesting position where you can help people understand science and research. In my undergrad health misinformation class, we spend the first month of class understanding what is science, what is the scientific process, what is research, what can and can't it do. What happens when a study seems to contradict everything else that science itself has said? Well, that's because we are. Because research's job, science's job, is to constantly disprove itself and to start thinking about newer, better ways of being. Here's a really lovely chart that I love to show. This is from Vox, and it looked at different studies about different ingredients that we've been told either do or don't cause cancer. Sometimes wine is shown to protect us against cancer. Sometimes wine gives us cancer. Sometimes studies say that coffee is bad. Sometimes they say it's good. Are all of these studies wrong? Do all of these researchers, are they just idiots that they don't know what they're talking about? No, because no one study makes a fact. Science is constantly out there doing new things, adding nuance, learning new things, improving upon the information we already have. That's science's job. So when one study comes out and says everything we know is wrong, okay, there's merit to that, but the story is larger than that. So adding nuance to that study, helping demystify science and research. I also think it's really important that getting out to the community to build trust rather than waiting for them to come to us, okay? If you place yourself as a trusted expert, you're gonna have an easier time fighting other trusted experts. So getting out in that community, demonstrating what you can and cannot do, showing those resources, really, really helping people understand what the library is for, what it can do, how anyone can have access to information. It's not just for a select few. Really, really partnering with communities on getting out there and really kind of building up your cred. And lastly, promoting new media literacy. It astounds me. I teach undergrads and it boggles my mind that they aren't great at using technology. They're not great at Google searching. They're not great at understanding how to fact check. They're awful at using the library. Oh my God, one of my whole class periods is how to use the online library system. So really promoting that health literacy and really, especially AI. AI is not always correct. It is a tool and we should not be afraid of it. We should learn how to use it. but helping people understand that it's just one more tool in the toolbox and it's not always going to get the job done. All right. So I'm going to stop here because I know we wanted some time for questions, and I know I talked a little bit too much, but if we do have questions, I would happily answer them and respond to them and share anything that I can with you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating talk, Heather. Um, we'd be happy to open it up to questions or comments from the audience, either in the chat or feel free to raise your hand. Or I think I see Andy, the first brave participant here. Go for it.
Do you have any suggestions for additional reading on this topic, especially as far as providing information and getting people to accept different ideas of what their concept of truth is versus fact and reality?
Yeah, and it's not like a here's one article that's going to save your life, right? It's kind of I mean, I've been keeping a reading list, and there's podcasts too that do a really good job of debunking certain things and helping people understand what science is and what it does and how to talk to people in your life. I the book that I use that I'll give you right now, but I'm also very, very happy to provide Brendan a list of resources. Once we're done here, I'm happy to do that. But the book that I would have you check out, and the one that I assigned for my undergrad misinformation class, is called The Misinformation Age. And it's a mass market book. It's I'm blanking on the author's names right now. Do you have it, Brendan?
I think I probably do. Hold on.
Okay. I read it a couple summers ago, and it actually inspired me. I used it again in class, and it doesn't just talk about health or politics. Yes, perfect. Thank you. That's exactly what it looks like.
It's Galen O'Connor and James Weatherall.
Yes, and it's great. It gives really good case examples. It gives a really good scientific understanding of why messages spread. It talks about researchers and science and how they can become biased and what their roles are. That's a great, great book. But again, I will definitely make a list and I'll send it to Brendan on stuff that just I've kind of found to be helpful. Yeah.
I guess I've got a question. I have to say, I'm also glad you brought up the RFK fluoride example. We were talking about politics in the office this morning and how, as you know, my area is conspiracy theories, and I couldn't agree more with your point that part of the problem here is that a lot of times this misinformation has grains of truth in it, and depending on the context, we're disinclined to acknowledge those grains of truth for fear of like how that could be distorted or not. And opening up a Pandora's box, I guess, of sorts, if we entertain these things. My related question is, how do you think about the problem with misinformation in certain fields, like with politics, for example, where, as you say, in science, there's a culture of humility, nuance, willingness to change one's mind in response to new evidence and things like this. And then when you try to enter the world of politics, let's say, that's a world that de-emphasizes or scorns on those kinds of qualities in favor of things like certainty, absolute confidence, clarity, decisiveness, right?
Yeah.
And so it feels like our systems aren't built for, at least when it comes to medical misinformation, certain systems are not built for that kind of environment that it requires to have reasonable debates or discussions about things. Like, is that fair to say, or how do you see meeting that challenge?
No, and yes, 100%. And that's the dangerous part, is that what I always tell my students is that anyone who tells you 100% on anything is lying to your face. And I cannot tell you with 100% certainty that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. I can't tell you that because I don't know. Just because it always has doesn't mean it will tomorrow. I don't know. So whenever you see someone telling you that this will cure cancer XYZ, 100%, this is guaranteed to blah, 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 that's a trigger right now that that person's lying to you. And unfortunately, to your point, we see that a lot of times experts will phrase arguments that way, even like reliable experts. The article that I was mentioning in the New York Times made a really good point about how we need to stop saying that thing's a lie, this thing's the truth. because it's not. And I think that that's the way, especially the CDC and the NIH and the FDA, that's the way that they've tried to tackle this, of telling people like, no, 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 that one's wrong, but this one's right. Well, okay, but like, why should people believe you? Right? So we need to stop doing that. And we need to create a culture wherein, think about it this way, like, if I gave you a 95% odds that you were going to win the lottery, you'd take those odds, right? Those are pretty good odds. So why is it when a scientist says, I'm 95% sure, but there is room for doubt, why is that taken as bad? Oh, well, you're not 100% sure. And so I think a lot of that is just science literacy, honestly. Scientific communication is a really new, burgeoning, specific subgenre of comm studies. And it's definitely really, really needed when talking about things like environmental hazards and things like that. But part of that is, yeah, never saying 100% for anything. But to your point, it's really dangerous when other people are out there saying that and perpetuating that idea that, well, I'm certain and these other people aren't.
Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
I'm very concerned about the next 4 years, and I haven't quite processed what that's going to mean yet for people in my particular fields. But no, I'm not happy. I'm not optimistic.
We're about to find out, I guess, one way or the one way or the
Yeah.
other. So,
Uh-huh.
other questions or comments from the audience here? Going once, twice.
Mine get
Yeah.
weird, like preparing for the apocalypse weird. Like at what point do you feel like there's a threshold where the lack of people who are intelligent enough to have these conversations, just evaporates
Yeah.
any point to having them,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as I was telling people earlier on the call, I don't really want to teach health misinformation to my undergrads over the next 4 years, because how am I going to compete with this? But I have to, like we have to. I mean, as long as there's people out there willing to fight the good fight, I have to believe that this will come back around and that we'll figure something out. I don't know how. I don't know how. I don't know what that looks like, but I mean, it's my duty to be out there and just try to reach as many people as I possibly can. I don't know. It's bleak.
I happen to get some weird transmissions from the future from an AI that tells us how to solve this. I'll link you to them here. That's
Wonderful.
awesome.
Anyone else? Well, thank you so much, Heather, for taking the time. This was a really fascinating talk and certainly timely as we confront what's ahead of us here in the next few years. So I'm sure I hope Heather doesn't mind my saying. I'm sure she'd be happy to follow up with any questions if any occur to you, here after the later this afternoon or next week or something on this topic. And if there's nothing else, I will stop the recording and we'll see everybody next time for our next Lunch and Learn, which I think is in January. Just if you want to mark it on your calendar, we've got a USM postdoc talking to us about conspiracy theories in American military history. So you won't want to miss that one.
Wow.
So at any rate, thanks everyone. I appreciate it. Have a good rest of your weekend. We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.